Hello, and welcome to the M.O.W. channel. Today, we begin our story on the Virginia Tech shooting of 2007. Before we start, please don't forget to subscribe and like the video, it really helps us. Alright, let's begin. On April 16, 2007, a shadow fell over the campus of Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, better known as Virginia Tech. Just as spring had come into full bloom, the morning calm shattered into chaos as the United States witnessed the deadliest campus massacre in its history. The perpetrator was Seung-Hui Cho, a 23-year-old student. He had set foot on American soil at the age of 8, carrying a suitcase full of dreams. But the American dream promised to him turned into a brutal reality, one filled with isolation, despair, and unrelenting hopelessness. This first chapter traces the journey of how an immigrant youth's soul became poisoned by extreme hatred and a deep-seated victim mentality, and how the society, education system, and judicial authorities surrounding him ignored or missed crucial warning signs that might have prevented the tragedy. Cho's isolation began with language, the most fundamental barrier. From a young age, he suffered from a severe speech disorder, which became a massive obstacle to adapting to a new environment. His stuttering made him an easy target for relentless bullying by his peers. Continuous harassment and ostracism throughout his elementary and middle school years left deep, indelible scars on his identity. The verbal abuse, as humiliating as physical violence, made him see the world as a hostile and antagonistic place. Over time, this victimhood and profound shame evolved into paranoid delusions. Cho began to believe that the world was conspiring against him, intentionally mocking and tormenting him. Trapped in this loneliness, he shut off all contact with the outside world, retreating deeply into his own inner universe. In college, Cho's isolation and latent violence began to manifest more explicitly in an academic setting. As an English major, the plays, stories, and poems he submitted were disturbingly violent and blood-soaked. In class, he was like a shadow, silent during presentations, sometimes muttering incoherent words. His writing was filled with threatening language that unsettled those around him. Some professors were so alarmed that they reported his assignments to the university administration. However, despite these glaring red flags, the school's response was fragmented and superficial. They made only temporary efforts, such as referring him to counseling services or removing him from classes, but failed to recognize him as a dangerous individual who should have been closely monitored or even isolated from society. Things escalated further when Cho stalked several female students, leading to police reports. Yet again, these incidents were treated as isolated cases, failing to stop a train already barreling out of control. The most critical moment came in late 2005, after Cho left a note suggesting suicidal intent and displayed signs of self-harm. Campus police and judicial authorities finally intervened. He was temporarily detained at a local mental health facility and evaluated by a court. The court concluded that he was suffering from serious mental illness and was a danger to himself. Under federal law, such a ruling should have permanently disqualified him from purchasing firearms, but a catastrophic bureaucratic error occurred. Virginia's state court records were never properly entered into the federal background check system. As a result, on paper, Cho was still able to legally pass a background check and buy guns. This missing record was more than a clerical mistake. It was essentially a license for mass murder. Additionally, critical information about his mental health status was not shared between agencies. Mental health professionals were aware of his violent tendencies and paranoid delusions, but privacy laws prevented them from sharing this information with the university or the public. Consequently, the university did not recognize him as a potential killer, and law enforcement did not block his access to weapons. By then, Cho had become an isolated figure pushed to society's edge, and rather than saving or restraining him, the system, aware of the risks, failed to act, effectively enabling him to obtain the means of his massacre. His rage was the culmination of long-suppressed pain, social indifference, and systemic breakdowns, all of which combined to create the conditions for his violent eruption. All these layers of failure laid the dark foundation upon which Cho would plan and execute one of the most devastating acts of violence in American history. The massacre that unfolded at Virginia Tech was, by no means, a spontaneous outburst of emotion. It was a cold-blooded scenario, where hatred that had been festering for years, meticulous planning, and was brought to execution. If Seung-Hui Cho's inner world had already been destroyed, then this second chapter focuses on how that destruction was translated into action. Specifically, how he acquired his weapons and crafted his manifesto. It illustrates how the desperate cry of one immigrant youth collided with America's loopholes in gun laws, producing the worst possible outcome. Cho's preparations for the massacre began in early 2007. The first step was securing the tools of his revenge. On February 9, he visited a gun store in Virginia and purchased a .22 caliber pistol. About a month later, on March 16, He bought a 9mm handgun. Through a series of steps, he acquired these two firearms, along with hundreds of rounds of ammunition and high-capacity magazines. The most tragic irony of this case is that all of these purchases were made legally, within the boundaries of state and federal law. As mentioned in Chapter 1, despite having previously been declared mentally ill and a danger to himself by a court, Cho was still able to maintain a clean record because of a critical administrative error. The state of Virginia failed to enter that court ruling into the federal background check database. This meant that the most reliable safeguard against his violent potential never existed. Cho didn't exploit a hidden loophole. He walked straight through a gaping flaw built into the system itself. This legal access to firearms became the final trigger that allowed his inner violence to materialize in reality. After obtaining his weapons, Cho set out to frame his attack not as a simple act of murder, but as a declaration of war, a twisted message of revenge aimed at the world. He composed a manifesto exceeding 1,800 words, which was far more than a mere suicide note. It was a record of hatred, filled with rage, paranoia, and distorted ideology. In the document, he cursed those he described as the rich, the hedonists, and the deceitful charlatans who had wronged him. He generalized his suffering as the suffering of all the oppressed, and tried to justify his violent actions as acts of righteous judgment. In the hours leading up to the massacre, Cho prepared a package containing this manifesto. Alongside the written text, it included 27 video clips and 43 photographs, all recorded and staged by himself. In these videos, he appeared wearing a red beret, brandishing pistols or hammers, and striking menacing poses. The messages he delivered to the camera were a disturbing mix of self-pity and grandiosity. He even compared himself to Jesus Christ, claiming that his death would inspire a generation of weak and defenseless people. Such delusions reveal how profoundly detached his mind was from reality, and indicate that his motive went far beyond mere revenge. It was rooted in a distorted savior complex. Cho mailed this package between the first and second shootings, deliberately sending it to major American news networks from a local post office. This was a calculated media strategy, designed to ensure that his actions would be discussed under the full glare of global attention. Even the choice of target and the sequence of the attack were meticulously planned. Cho selected Norris Hall, an engineering building, as his second primary site. With its cluster of classrooms, it offered an ideal setting for maximizing. Just before the assault, he used chains and padlocks. He had prepared in advance to seal off key exits in the hallways. This prevented victims from escaping and delayed police entry from outside. A deadly trap that magnified the devastation. Every step he took demonstrated that his actions were not driven by sudden rage, but followed a deliberately constructed script. These preparations show that the madness within him had evolved beyond emotional turmoil into a cold and calculated plan, equipped with concrete methods and tools for revenge. The tragedy of April 16, 2007. Began as quietly as the morning mist. At 7:15 a.m., the first gunshots shattered the calm at West Ambler Johnston Hall, a co-ed dormitory on the southwestern side of the Virginia Tech campus. It was a time when the halls would normally be filled with the sounds of students preparing for their day. But on this morning, Seung-Hui Cho began his rampage. Inside room 212, he shot and killed a 20-year-old female student, then turned his gun on a dormitory resident advisor who arrived at the scene moments later. These two innocent victims had no personal connection to Cho. They were, in the purest sense, randomly selected targets. Within minutes, the dormitory corridor was drenched in fear and blood. By the time police arrived in response to the first emergency call, Cho had already fled the scene. Investigators immediately began examining the double homicide. However, it was at this very point that the most catastrophic misjudgment, one that could have prevented the worst school massacre in U.S. history, was made. Based solely on the early evidence and initial circumstances, police and university officials failed to recognize the incident as the opening act of a broader campus-wide attack. Instead, they made the fatal mistake of interpreting it as a crime of passion, perhaps the result of a domestic dispute or a personal conflict within the dormitory. Since the suspect had left the scene, and the victims were confined to a single location, they concluded with dangerous complacency that the threat was contained. The consequences of this misjudgment were devastating. University administrators hesitated to issue an emergency alert that could have warned the entire student body of potential danger. This alert system, designed to reach students by email and text message, remained silent. Senior officials feared that sending a campus-wide warning might cause panic and chaos, and they also worried about damaging the university's reputation by overreacting. Thus, the golden window of opportunity, the period during which many lives could have been saved, was wasted amid bureaucratic indecision and misplaced caution. From 7:30 a.m. to roughly 9:40 a.m., a critical 2-hour and 10-minute vacuum followed. During this time, Life on campus continued as normal. Students finished their breakfasts and made their way to their 930 classes. Buildings like Norris Hall, densely packed with classrooms, began to fill up with students. No one knew that 2 people had already been murdered. Less than 2 hours earlier, no one realized that the killer was still wandering somewhere on campus, preparing for his next move. What was Cho doing during this period? He left the dormitory and walked to a nearby post office. This short journey was part of his cold and deliberate preparation for the second act of his massacre. At the post office, he mailed a package, a manifesto he had prepared to major U.S. news networks. Inside was his declaration of war, a document saturated with narcissism and delusions of grandeur, explaining why he was about to commit mass murder and what he believed his actions represented. Cho wanted his crimes to be seen not as mere killings, but as a righteous judgment against societal injustice. Sending this package was a conscious act, a way to complete the narrative he had constructed around his violence. Meanwhile, police were still focused on identifying the suspect. From the first shooting, they had no knowledge of the package or its contents. Their investigation during those 2 hours failed to grasp the true scale of the situation. While they processed the dormitory crime scene, Cho calmly reloaded his weapons, prepared ammunition magazines, and checked his final route to Norris Hall. Had even one university administrator issued an immediate campus-wide evacuation order after the initial killings, the hundreds of students who later gathered in Norris Hall might have escaped in time. The absence of that warning became, in effect, a death sentence for the 30 victims soon to be trapped inside its classrooms. In the aftermath, the official investigative report was scathing. It concluded that those 2 hours of silence were the single most significant structural failure that caused the death toll to skyrocket. The alert system existed, but it was human hesitation and misjudgment, not the lack of technology, that turned a preventable tragedy into a historic catastrophe. The 2 hours during which the campus failed to recognize the danger of the first shooting finally came to an end. Now, the stage of the tragedy shifted to Norris Hall, the heart of Virginia Tech's College of Engineering. Norris Hall was a 2-story building packed with classrooms and laboratories, and on that morning, hundreds of students and professors were gathered there for their classes. Around 9:40 a.m., Seung-Hui Cho entered Norris Hall armed with the same guns he had used in the first attack, along with an additional handgun and multiple magazines. Ammunition magazines were taped to his body, a chilling sign of how carefully he had planned to inflict maximum casualties in a short period of time. His first action was to seal off the exits. Using heavy chains and padlocks he had prepared beforehand, Cho locked the main doors of Norris Hall from the outside. This effectively trapped everyone inside the building, leaving students and faculty with no way to escape and preventing police or emergency responders from entering quickly. Norris Hall was transformed into a massive, isolated chamber, and those inside were now at the mercy of a killer. The shooting began in the 200-level classrooms. Cho moved down the hallway, breaking into classrooms and bursting inside. Students and professors, completely unaware of what was happening, were suddenly thrown into a nightmare. In the middle of lectures, the appearance of an armed gunman was an incomprehensible shock. The hallways echoed with screams and gunfire as chaos erupted. Cho's attack was merciless and swift. He opened fire on everyone in the classrooms with chilling composure. In a matter of seconds, nearly 10 people could be killed in a single classroom. Survivors later testified that Cho did not target anyone specifically. He shot at anything that moved, and that his expression showed no anger or hesitation, only a terrifying blankness. Even amid this unimaginable terror, moments of courage and selflessness emerged. Some professors and students bravely resisted the attacker. One of the most heroic figures was Liviu Librescu, a Holocaust survivor and Romanian-born professor. At 80 years old, he was teaching a mechanical engineering class when the gunfire drew closer. Realizing the danger, Professor Librescu threw himself against the classroom door and held the handle with all his strength, shouting for his students to jump out the windows to safety. Thanks to his actions, many students were able to escape. When Cho finally broke through the door and shot Professor Librescu, most of the class had already made it out. His final act became a symbol of the greatest courage and self-sacrifice a human being can display in the face of mortal danger. Similar acts of resistance and bravery occurred in other classrooms. One professor tried to barricade the door with desks and chairs to delay the gunman's entry. Some students, with nowhere to hide, pretended to be dead or concealed themselves behind furniture, surviving the attack. Others seized the brief moment when Cho reloaded his gun to dash out into the hallway and escape. All of these actions, made within mere seconds or minutes, were driven by an instinct to survive, and in many cases, those split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. The massacre inside Norris Hall lasted about 10 minutes. In that short span of time, Cho killed more than 30 innocent people. The deadly combination of overwhelming firepower and a sealed building created one of the worst tragedies in modern history. Police and SWAT teams rushed to the scene upon hearing reports of the second shooting, but the chains and locks Cho had placed delayed their entry. By the time officers finally breached the doors and stormed into Norris Hall, the massacre had already reached its horrific conclusion. At around 9:50 a.m., as police approached room 200, Cho turned one of his guns on himself and took his own life. His rampage ended there, but the devastation he left behind shocked not only the United States but the entire world. Norris Hall remained a haunting scene, classrooms stained with blood, shattered furniture, and the lingering shadows of those who had lost their lives. After the final gunshot echoed through Norris Hall and the shooter took his own life, the scene immediately shifted into a zone of emergency rescue and police investigation. SWAT units and police officers, their tension at its peak, swept through the building, and what they found was horrifying. In the hallways and classrooms lay the bodies of 30 innocent victims, including the 2 victims from the first shooting. The total death toll rose to 32, marking the event as the deadliest school shooting in American history. As breaking news flashed across the globe, the world watched in shock, and Virginia Tech students and faculty were plunged into profound grief. In the immediate aftermath, the entire campus descended into chaos. The university administration finally issued an emergency alert to students and canceled all classes, but by then, it was far too late. Terrified students, trapped in dormitories and classrooms, desperately tried to contact their families. The areas around the campus were overwhelmed, with parents rushing to check on their children's safety and media crews from around the world. The sounds of helicopters circling above, the frantic movements of paramedics, and the cries of grieving families as victims were identified, all testified to the fact that this tragedy was more than just an incident. It had left an indelible trauma on the entire community. The tragedy sent shockwaves not only through the victims' families, but also through the Korean-American community, which had no direct connection to the incident. When it was revealed that the shooter was of Korean descent, Koreans around the world expressed profound shock and dismay. The South Korean government immediately issued a statement of condolence, offering deep sympathy to the United States and the victims' families. Korean society engaged in deep reflection on the causes and context of the tragedy, sharing a collective sense of guilt and sorrow. The actions of one individual had cast a dark shadow over Korean communities worldwide. Following the crisis, the governor of Virginia established an independent review panel to investigate every aspect of the tragedy. The panel's report aimed to expose all systemic and administrative failures that had contributed to the disaster. The findings were deeply troubling. As discussed in Chapter 3, the most critical failure was the university's inadequate response. The failure to issue a timely and effective campus-wide warning during the 2-hour window between the first and second shootings was identified as a major reason so many lives were lost. A lack of communication between police and university officials, poor crisis assessment, and an inefficient alert system all played a role in the catastrophic outcome. Moreover, the panel sharply criticized the legal loopholes that allowed the shooter to purchase firearms legally. Cho had previously been ordered by a Virginia court to undergo treatment for severe mental health issues, but state law enforcement had failed to enter this information into the federal background check system for gun buyers, a critical administrative error. Had this information been properly recorded, he would have been prohibited from purchasing firearms, and the tragedy might have been prevented altogether. The report highlighted the dangerous gap between Virginia's mental health laws and gun control regulations, calling for fundamental systemic reform. The report and public outrage quickly led to legislative changes. Virginia passed new laws strengthening the background check system for gun buyers, mandating that court records related to mental health be automatically reported to the federal system. This closed a dangerous loophole linking legal oversight to deadly consequences. The impact of these reforms extended beyond the state level, influencing the passage of federal legislation aimed at improving firearm background checks. The Virginia Tech Massacre, though the act of a single individual, forced American society to confront the issue of institutional accountability, and it became a pivotal turning point in the nation's ongoing debate over gun control. In the aftermath, Virginia Tech began the long and painful process of healing. At the center of the campus, a memorial was erected to honor and remember the victims. The monument, engraved with the names of all 32 victims, symbolizes the university community's pledge never to forget. Students frequently place flowers and messages at the memorial, reflecting on the solidarity and courage that emerged amid the tragedy. The Virginia Tech shooting is not merely a chapter of the past. It remains a painful lesson that continues to echo through today's debates over school safety, mental health care, and gun regulation. Its resonance calls upon society to confront both systemic responsibility and the conscience of humanity. That's all for today's story. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and join us again. tomorrow for another new story.